have an extraordinary situation politically in the United States that has gone very underappreciated by the fact that the media has insisted on treating this as so normal and so natural and so justified that an appreciation for just how remarkable it is has started to very quickly erode. Namely, the former president of the United States, the person who ran and governed the executive branch in the United States from 2017 until 2020, Donald Trump, who happens also to be the front runner in all polls to become the Republican nominee for president, and obviously in a polarized society like ours that is basically 50-50, gives him a very good chance to unseat the current incumbent president, Joe Biden, and win the presidency again. He is being prosecuted in 3 different courts, 2 of which are federal prosecutions, which means that they are being brought and overseen by an agency, the Department of Justice, that answers directly to his political opponent, Joe Biden, and a 3rd prosecution, which has been brought in Manhattan by a district attorney who is openly a left liberal prosecutor. His campaign was benefited greatly by a massive donation from George Soros to a PAC that ended up supporting Alvin Bragg's campaign for a Manhattan district attorney. And all 3 cases have something in common, which is that they are not the kind of classic typical crimes one typically thinks merit prosecution. Murder and rape and kidnapping and extortion, or even political crimes of the kind that we are all conditioned to expect and want, such as prosecutions for bribery, other forms of political corruption. Each of these cases requires a rather dubious interpretation of law. In the case of the first prosecution in Manhattan and now this last prosecution in Washington, based on the events around January 6th in the 2020 election, in order for the prosecution to even have a chance to bring Trump to trial, they will have to prevail by convincing a court to adopt an interpretation of law it had never previously adopted. In other words, they are looking to pioneer the law to create brand new precedent as a way of prosecuting Trump. The second indictment, which is the one in Mar-a-Lago, based on Trump's allegedly reckless handling of classified information, is the sort of thing for which people have been previously prosecuted, but it's also far more often behavior that does not prompt prosecutions, especially when engaged in by high-level, powerful political actors every single day. Literally, members of the media and members of the Biden administration engage in transactions that provoke and cause and celebrate the unauthorized disclosure of classified information, and virtually never is there even investigations to find out who did it, let alone prosecutions for it, even though that involves the public disclosure of top secret information, because that is the stuff of which Washington is made. It's the stuff that drives Washington every day. And yet Trump, who's not even accused of having disclosed the information, only recklessly maintained it, even though everybody agrees he had the unilateral and unreviewable power to declassify it, is being charged under the Espionage Act of 1917. Regardless of your view of the merit or lack thereof in all 3 of these cases, we are undoubtedly, as we so often have been in the Trump era, faced with a genuinely unprecedented political situation, a historically unprecedented political situation, not due to the actions of Donald Trump, but due to the actions of those unified against him in the name of sabotaging his presidency, his campaign, and his entire movement, essentially looking to criminalize not just Donald Trump, but Trump politics in general. And earlier today, there was an op-ed in, of all places, the New York Times. The New York Times will air a certain kind of dissent, provided that the person who wants to write the article has impeccable establishment credentials, and such is the case for the author of this op-ed. His name is Jack Goldsmith. He was a high-level member of the Bush Justice Department, and even though he was part of a Republican administration, he ended up being very popular among the media because he was often very reluctant to endorse a lot of the more extreme theories of executive power that people like John Yoo and various lawyers of Dick Cheney were promoting. He was kind of the person standing in the Justice Department saying this goes too far. in particular when it came time for the Bush and Cheney administration to adopt and affirm a kind of warrantless eavesdropping, spying on American citizens that had clearly been criminalized and outlawed by the Congress, only for various extremist Bush-Cheney lawyers to adopt a theory of presidential power that said basically the president can violate the law as long as doing so is justified in the name of terrorism. It was Jack Goldsmith in the Bush Justice Department, along with a couple of others who were resistant to being able to do that. So he gained a lot of trust, a lot of popularity among the corporate media at the time. And he's also a very well-regarded professor of law at Harvard Law School. So there's no questioning his credentials or his pedigree. And so he's one of the very few people that is willing to use his credentials to insert dissent into our political discourse. I've been somebody who has admired Professor Goldsmith for a long time. We often have similar views, but certainly not always. When I was writing about the Bush administration early on, I was often very critical of him, and yet he's extremely smart, and I find him to be a person of very high integrity. And he's clearly a Trump critic. In fact, he's somebody who believes it's very reasonable, if not likely, that Trump committed crimes, at least in one of these cases, if not all three. And yet, nonetheless, he has an article in the New York Times today, an op-ed, warning, as the headline there suggests, quote, "The prosecution of Trump may have terrible consequences." And it tries to lure the New York Times reader into his argument by constantly affirming what he knows they believe, which is Trump is a bad person, he acted horribly when it came to January 6th, and that even there may be components of his behavior that are not just morally offensive, but over the legal line. He's willing to concede all that in order to nonetheless make this argument that I think is very well crafted. And to be honest, I think it's something that even those of us who have been making this argument can sometimes lose sight of. As I was saying at the beginning, in this kind of day-to-day frenzy of thinking about the news, and every day there's a new development or a new event around Donald Trump or those united against him, it's easy sometimes to forget how spectacular, how remarkable it is that the current government is prosecuting their leading political opponent in two separate cases, at least so far, in order to put him into prison as we head into the election that will determine who will be president for the next 4 years. That is a shocking situation for American politics, no matter your views on Donald Trump or on the specific legal issues raised. And here's the argument that he makes, quote, "It may be satisfying now to see the special counsel Jack Smith indict Donald Trump for his reprehensible and possibly criminal actions in connection with the 2020 presidential election. But the prosecution, which might be justified, reflects a tragic choice that will compound the harms to the nation from Mr. Trump's many transgressions. Mr. Smith's indictment outlines a factually compelling but far from legally airtight case against Mr. Trump. The case involves novel applications of 3 criminal laws and raises tricky issues of Mr. Trump's intent, his freedom of speech, and the contours of presidential power." Now, let me just stop here and say that when Jack Smith filed this indictment, he was very aware of all of those issues Professor Goldsmith just identified. Remember that what liberals really wanted was a prosecution trying to convict President Trump on charges that he was the one who, quote, inspired or engineered what they still considered to be the insurrection of January 6th, namely the 3-hour riot. And what they were hoping for was a theory that said, a prosecution theory that said, with the speech that Trump gave to that crowd that had assembled, he essentially directed them to go to the Capitol and engage in violence, and by doing so, he became responsible. And it was very clear that that was not just a dubious, but a dangerous theory. We devoted an entire show to explaining the contours of the First Amendment as defined by the landmark cases of the 20th century, particularly in the 2 cases of Brandenburg and Claiborne, that says essentially any form of political expression, even political expression that advocates the necessity for violence as a response to political injustice, is protected by the free speech clause as long as it does not lead to the imminent incitement of a gathered crowd, meaning somebody says to a crowd gathered on a corner, go burn down that house, and they then go and burn down that house. And of course, liberals hear that and they think Trump falls into that exception, but Trump told the crowd, let's march to the Capitol and do so peacefully. You can just look at the transcript of Trump's speech, search for the word peacefully, and you will see that. So it was almost impossible to bring a case based on that dream that liberals had that Trump would actually be accused of inciting what they call an insurrection. Instead, he brought a case that does actually raise issues of free speech because the indictment is predicated on the view that Trump's claims that there was fraud, outcome determinative fraud in the 2020 election was both false and something Trump knew to be false. So it's essentially a way to criminalize disinformation. It's saying Trump spread disinformation. He then petitioned the government based on his false claim, and that is somehow a crime. And what Jack Smith did, knowing that this was going to be an issue and one that the media was going to be forced to discuss, was he inserted a paragraph very early on in the indictment that said, obviously, even a president has the constitutional right to express views that are false. And so every time somebody says this indictment is predicated on trying to criminalize President Trump's political speech, idiots in the media and liberal activists will point to Jack Smith's paragraph and say, oh, look, the prosecutor himself says it's not based on that. Therefore, why do you keep saying it is when the indictment itself says it isn't? Imagine the naivete and the ignorance required to believe that because a prosecutor says something about his own theories of criminality and prosecution that they're binding on all of us to just mindlessly accept. So because Jack Smith says this is not a case that infringes on free speech rights, automatically we're supposed to reject any claims that it is. Here's Professor Goldsmith, as you can see, a very stalwart critic of President Trump and especially his behavior in connection with the 2020 election, pointing out that this indictment absolutely does raise pressing questions involving freedom of speech and his intent and the contours of presidential power, even though the prosecutor said in his indictment that that's not the case. Goldsmith goes on, quote, if the prosecution fails, especially if the trial concludes after a general election that Mr. Trump loses, it will be a historic disaster. Imagine that. The prosecution here, the Justice Department, the Biden Justice Department, through a special counsel, brings an indictment against President Trump. Let's assume, as is very possible, that the trial doesn't happen before the election is held. The election is held, Trump loses, and then at some point after that, the trial is held and Trump is acquitted. Imagine what a historic and irretrievable disgrace that will be to the Justice Department. Imagine how many millions of Americans will become even more convinced that the Justice Department is irredeemably corrupted and cannot be trusted because they will have gotten what they wanted, which was Trump's defeat by indicting him, only for then the trial to acquit him. That is the gigantic risk that is being taken through this prosecution. He continues, quote, but even if the prosecution succeeds in convincing Mr. Trump before or after the election, the cost to the legal and political systems will be large. There is no getting around the fact that the indictment comes from the Biden administration when Mr. Trump holds a formidable lead in the polls to secure the Republican Party nomination and is running neck and neck with Mr. Biden, the Democratic Party's probable nominee. This deeply unfortunate timing looks political and has potent political implications even if it is not driven by partisan motivations. And it is the Biden administration's responsibility, as its Justice Department reportedly delayed the investigation of Mr. Trump for a year and then rushed to indict him well into the GOP primary season. The unseemliness of the prosecution will most likely grow if the Biden campaign or its proxies use it as a weapon against Mr. Trump if he is nominated. Imagine, and it's almost inevitable that it will happen, that if, as all polls show is highly likely, Donald Trump is the Republican nominee, and we head into the general election, a major theme of the Biden campaign of Democrats is going to be that Donald Trump is criminally charged by this heroic prosecutor. So they will have brought charges using their power over the justice system to indict people, the Biden administration will, and then they will immediately exploit that, extract all the political value they have to gain from that by weaponizing those indictments in their political quest to defeat Donald Trump. Just imagine the perception that that will create justifiably. Goldsmith goes on, quote, "This is all happening against the backdrop of perceived unfairness in the DOJ's earlier investigation, originating in the Obama administration, of Mr. Trump's connections to Russia in the 2016 general election. Anti-Trump texts by the lead FBI investigator, a former FBI director who put Mr. Trump in a bad light through improper disclosure of FBI documents and information, transgressions by FBI and Justice Department officials in securing permission to surveil a Trump associate, and more were condemned by the Justice Department's Inspector General, even as he found no direct evidence of political bias in the investigation. The discredited Steele dossier, which played a consequential role in the Russia investigation, and especially its public narrative, grew out of opposition research by the Democratic National Committee and the Hillary Clinton campaign." Now, this is a perfect example of something that I think we, again, easily forget in the incessant tsunami of new political news, little bits that we're supposed to digest and keep us entertained. The debacle that was Russiagate is, in my view, the greatest political scandal in the last 2 decades at least. I was listening to a YouTube show that is hosted by a couple of left liberals, and because I don't remember the exact words that they said, I don't want to attribute it to them by name, but essentially the point that they were making was, look, Russiagate is over. It's in the past. It's time to forget about Russiagate. And the fact that they acknowledge Russiagate was a fraud perpetrated by the FBI and the CIA doesn't mean that the current investigation or indictment of President Trump is equally invalid. And the reason why that's preposterous is because it's the very, very same people and the very same agencies and the very same lawyers operating with the exact same motives who foisted that gigantic fraud in the country. It's like saying, okay, yes, the advocates of Biden's war policy in Ukraine, the people who are telling us what we should think about Russia and Ukraine, are the exact same people who have lied about and defended every war since Iraq, from Iraq to Syria to Libya and Afghanistan and beyond. But that's all in the past. We shouldn't think about that when deciding whether it's time to think whether they're reliable and genuine now. Of course you use the political context to assess current events. That's what history is for. That's what this context is for. I thought the other day about an article, or multiple articles, that reported on how when Robert Mueller closed his investigation without indicting one American, not one, on the core conspiracy theory that gave rise to the Mueller investigation and the 18 months of intense media coverage and indictments and subpoenas and testimony and digging into records, not a single person indicted on the core conspiracy that the Trump campaign criminally conspired with the Russian government to hack into the DNC's emails or John Podesta's emails. And when he further filed his report, explicitly stating that after searching for 18 months, with unlimited resources, with the dream team of prosecutors, with full subpoena power, that in the words of Robert Mueller, they could find no evidence to establish that that actually happened. After that happened, that should have shook every single major institution of authority in this country, especially corporate media outlets, at their foundation. And there was reporting that the then editor-in-chief, the executive editor of the New York Times, Dean Baskey, when that happened, when Mueller closed his investigation, didn't indict anybody on that charge, and then filed his report, he addressed the newsroom and he said, look, we have to admit everything we said was going to happen and we told our readers to expect and that we expected ended up not happening. The entire storyline from the start was a gigantic scam. And it was cooked up in the bowels of the CIA and the FBI and fed to the Washington Post and the New York Times principally, which ended up giving themselves Pulitzers for that reporting and especially the role of Russian interference in the 2016 election, which only mattered because of suspicions that Trump played a part in that. It was a scam that exposed as illegitimate almost every institution of American authority, but especially the justice system. Exactly as Professor Goldsmith points out in this op-ed, we know for sure that the people inside the FBI, like Peter Strzok, who were playing key parts in this investigation, while they were doing that, were talking about not only their contempt for Donald Trump, but the need to do everything in their power to sabotage his election, his campaign. The political motive was explicit. It was in documents that we all read that came from the exact places in the FBI responsible for that investigation. And then we know that James Comey and Andrew McCabe constantly leaked illegally findings of that investigation to the New York Times and the Washington Post. Andrew McCabe was fired as a result of lying to the FBI in their internal investigation about whether he leaked. And he then, after being disgraced for lying, got hired by CNN to help report the news. None of these institutions had any accountability at all because they knew they got caught, but they didn't care because they believed their cause was so just that they were entitled to do anything, including lie, in the name of stopping Trump. That's how righteous they believed their cause was. And they looked at people who got caught lying, like Andrew McCabe or this Miles Taylor, who wrote that op-ed under an anonymous byline saying, I'm inside the Trump administration and it's bad as you think. And he was repeatedly asked whether he was the author, and he lied and said he wasn't, including to CNN. Of course, he got hired by CNN also, and he told his own colleagues falsely when asked that he wasn't the author of that. He lied straight to their face. These people all got caught and revealed as liars and as corrupt political actors abusing the law for political ends. Inside the FBI, inside the CIA, inside the Justice Department, these are the same exact people now prosecuting Donald Trump and now justifying these indictments. And so, of course, there's extremely compelling reasons to distrust the motives behind this indictment and the indictment itself, because the Justice Department has proven itself under first President Obama, where Russiagate began, and then under President Biden, to be completely corrupted for political ends. And the irony of that is that that's what they spent 4 years accusing Donald Trump of doing. Remember, he treated the Justice Department like his own personal law firm. He treated the Attorney General like his own personal lawyer. And meanwhile, the whole time he had there Bill Barr, who, as we all now know, was very willing to say no to Donald Trump and to conclude that a lot of things Donald Trump was saying and doing were baseless. He was a zillion times more independent, Bill Barr was, than the people that in the FBI and Justice Department under Obama, now Biden, are so blatantly and flagrantly abusing the powers of our law enforcement system for political reasons. So that's part of the context in which this indictment or these indictments have emerged, that there's already this very pervasive and justified distrust on the part of American institutions of power generally, and the Justice Department and FBI in particular, because of this extraordinary debacle that I know everybody wants to move on from. Because people are embarrassed by it. They have nothing to say about it to justify it. It all collapsed with the Mueller investigation. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.